Well, how can Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller and his staff possibly keep up with all of the suspicious developments in the Trump relationship to Russia and Vladimir Putin and the friends of Vladimir Putin? Consider just this item from the New York Times tonight. This week, the Trump administration further eased its pressure on Rusal, Russia's largest aluminum company, less than 4 months after sanctions on it and its notorious leader were imposed, even as the White House seems willing to inflict pain on American farmers and consumers with its trade wars. Russian aluminum workers are apparently worthy of special protection. And that is special protection from Donald Trump. Rusal is controlled by Vladimir Putin's friend, Oleg Deripaska, who, as the Times points out, quote, has been investigated for money laundering and accused of threatening the lives of business rivals, illegally wiretapping a government official, and taking part in extortion and racketeering. And there are allegations that he also, quote, ordered the murder of a businessman and had links to a Russian organized crime group. During the presidential campaign, Paul Manafort was very friendly with Oleg Deripaska, or at least tried to be. He offered him private briefings about the presidential campaign. Now, if Paul Manafort is convicted in his current trial or in his next trial, he might then be willing to make a deal with Robert Mueller and tell him everything he knows about Oleg Deripaska and many other things, which could then reveal why Donald Trump gave Oleg Deripaska and his Russian aluminum company a very sweet deal this week. And that's just this week's highlight in the further mysteries of the Trump-Russia relationship. Why did Deripaska get that deal and get it this week? Was it something Vladimir Putin asked for in his one-on-one meeting with Donald Trump? Was it the kind of favor Vladimir Putin was betting he would be able to get from a President Donald Trump? And is that one of the many reasons why Vladimir Putin attacked the American election, went to war on American democracy to help Donald Trump win the presidency?
Did you want President Trump to win the election, and did you direct any of your officials to help him do that?
Да, я хотел, чтобы он выиграл. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Because he talked about bringing the U.S.-Russia relationship back to normal.
How can Robert Mueller and his team possibly keep up with the suspicious activity that Donald Trump continues to engage in with Vladimir Putin and Russian businessmen? How could they possibly ask all of the right questions of Donald Trump if Donald Trump agreed to be interviewed by the special prosecutor and his team? Rudy Giuliani continued to play the public game today about the president being interviewed by the special prosecutor, claiming that they will decide whether the president will grant that interview within, quote, a week to 10 days. Rudy Giuliani is the very same person who said the entire case, whole thing, would be wrapped up within 2 weeks after he joined the Trump defense team on April 19th. Rudy Giuliani told Politico today that the Trump team wants to rule out of bounds about half of what Robert Mueller wants to discuss with the president. Quote, we don't want questioning on obstruction. They would have to concede that. So according to the Giuliani rules of the interview, Robert Mueller would not be allowed to ask President Trump what he said to James Comey about the FBI investigation of Michael Flynn. James Comey says that the president told him, I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy. I hope you can let this go. Giuliani says that the only area of inquiry that the Trump team would consider allowing is how Donald Trump and his campaign interacted with Russians during the presidential campaign. And a week after reports that Trump's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, is willing to testify that Donald Trump knew about the meeting in Trump Tower with Russians during the campaign before it occurred, NBC News is reporting today that the special prosecutor now wants to interview someone who helped arrange that meeting. NBC News reports that the special prosecutor has requested an interview with Ayman Agalarov, the Russian pop star who sent emails to Donald Trump Jr. to arrange that meeting in Trump Tower. Ayman Agalarov's American lawyer, Scott Balber, told NBC News conversations are ongoing about a potential interview and that it is, quote, unclear how this will play out, which as of tonight, could serve as the headline for the status of everything still under investigation by the special prosecutor. Unclear how this will play out. Leading off our discussion now, Joyce Vance, former federal prosecutor. She's a professor at the University of Alabama School of Law and an MSNBC contributor. Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City. And Eugene Robinson, associate editor and Pulitzer Prize-winning opinion writer for the Washington Post. He's an MSNBC political analyst. And Maya, you're a former federal prosecutor also. What do you make of the Giuliani conditions for the interview?
Well, in fairness, I was in the civil division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. I will say that, unfortunately, Giuliani has become someone whose career is not going to be looked at quite the same light as it was before this, because he really had a storied career. And what we're seeing is just this complete disintegration of what was a credible lawyer into someone who's lost all credibility. And while I've never agreed with Rudy Giuliani on many issues, including when he was mayor of New York City, I have to say I'm completely shocked about his behavior as a lawyer.
And Joyce, it seems that the Giuliani proposition, if true, but let me just, I should have prefaced all of this with, we have no idea what the truth is here. The Mueller investigation has not leaked a word, not a document, nothing. So if we are to believe that there has been communication about this recently from the Mueller team to the Giuliani team, we have to believe Rudy Giuliani's account of that, which is an extremely difficult thing to do. But let's do it for the sake of this discussion. But the truth is we have no idea what communication has been going on. But if the Giuliani conditions are what's being communicated to Mueller, is there any way for Mueller to accept those conditions?
It really depends on what Mueller thinks he needs out of this interview. And of course, we don't know all of the cards that he's holding right now. But one thing prosecutors don't do when they need an interview with a witness, they don't negotiate because they have the subpoena power. And it's abundantly clear, at least in my judgment, that they don't plan on indicting the president because they're seeking this interview. According to Giuliani and the president's lawyers, they've already said he's a subject, not a target. So if Mueller needs information that Giuliani and the other lawyers aren't willing to cede them the authority to ask, they'll simply issue a subpoena for the president and then let that run its way through the court process.
How long, Joyce, would that take through the court process?
You know, that's a really good question. It would depend on which grand jury they use. They could either go through D.C. or through Virginia, which would be the Fourth Circuit. Even if those were treated as emergency appeals, it would still stretch on for some time. You would have to have briefing in the Court of Appeals. Then it would likely go up to the United States Supreme Court. They could either decide it or return it in part to the lower court. So we could be looking at a process that would stretch out over months.
And Eugene Robinson, that's one of the reasons why Republicans are racing as fast as they can to confirm the next Supreme Court justice is the route that Joyce just described. But the Giuliani game of he wants to testify. The New York Times reporting last night, as if it was breaking news, that there are people in the White House who tell the New York Times that the president really wants to talk to the special prosecutor, but it's his lawyers who are reluctant. There's absolutely no way to back that up. We have no idea whether Donald Trump actually wants to talk to Mueller or not. All the indicators are that he's desperately afraid of talking to Mueller.
Yeah, he ought to be, I think, if he's not. It is true that Donald Trump does appear to believe he can talk his way out of anything, just by lying, basically. And that would be a really, really bad strategy to take into a meeting with the prosecutors, and that surely is what his lawyers are worried about. So I do believe that his lawyers don't want him to go in there and talk. And as to whether he really wants to do it or really doesn't want to do it, who knows? It could depend on the day. But as you said at the beginning, if we're taking Rudy Giuliani's word for this, we are really out on a very slender limb. It's frankly hard to talk about what Rudy says because we know that a lot of it, and I think the technical term for it is total crap. It's just not true.
Let's listen to the way the president's allies are talking about this possible interview publicly. Let's listen to the way Newt Gingrich describes the situation.
I think the president is very unwise to walk into a perjury trap against a group of smart guys who have spent a year's time getting ready to try to kill him. And I think he is not, no one is smart enough to take on all of Mueller's team.
And of course, Maya, there is no such thing as a perjury trap. There are only, all you have in perjury is someone who didn't tell the truth under oath.
That's right.
In other words, Newt Gingrich is saying it'd be very unwise for the president to take an oath. But in that, you're seeing a communication to the president's supporters out there, to the president's base, saying this is an unfair process, it's a trap, and it would be the wise course for the president is to avoid this kind of sleazy lawyer trap.
You know, and there's the truth of it, which is it would be extremely ill-advised for the president to talk to Mueller. Anybody who was his attorney would say, don't do it. Because it's not that it's a perjury trap. It's because he has a lot to be concerned about in terms of the questions he will get. He's already got inconsistent statements in the public purview. There's no way you can walk into an interview with a prosecutor with inconsistent statements, including some things that could easily, and in my view, would be an admission of guilt, particularly on an obstruction charge, which is why they don't want obstruction as part of the interview. That part I believe. If there's an interview, they don't want any conversation about obstruction. I think it actually points to something that I think I will disagree with Joyce on. It's one thing to say he's a subject, that Donald Trump is a subject of an investigation. Subjects can become targets. And the fact that they have said he's a subject doesn't mean he can't become a target, which is the very reason why they don't want him to testify. And I think you're absolutely right. This entire political strategy, not legal strategy, but political strategy, has been to convince the Trump base that there is nothing they should be concerned about in terms of Trump's behavior. And here's the question I would ask anyone without regard to political affiliation. If you have nothing to hide, you cooperate. This is not cooperation.
Yeah, and Joyce, to that issue of subject versus target, it's a long time ago that we got this information that they were told he was a subject. I think it was last year. And so there's been plenty of time for that to have shifted.
That's true. And as Maya says, many of us have sort of contemplated, could there be such a significant quantum of evidence against the president at some point that he would become a target? But DOJ has a long-standing policy for reasons that folks have debated whether they're still viable or not, but it concludes that a sitting president cannot be indicted. There are many people who believe that Mueller will not buck that precedent, particularly since he brought with him from the Solicitor General's office an appellate lawyer, Michael Dreeben, who's known for his institutionalist views. And so the consensus seems to be among many people that Mueller would be far more likely to include all of this evidence in a report that would go up on the Hill, that would form the body potentially of an impeachment proceeding if the folks on the Hill at that point in time were to decide to go that direction, rather than making the president the target of an investigation and ultimately an indictment.
Oh, so Joyce, when you're using the word target, you just mean in direct relationship to the other word indictment.
Yeah, exactly. And I should say, Lawrence, that's a term of art within the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
Either you're a witness, a subject, or a target.
But he is, in effect, Eugene Robinson, a target for impeachment in the outcome of this investigation, especially on the question of obstruction of justice. The only person who could obstruct justice in this story is Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, and certainly the only person who's done it repeatedly and in public, to say nothing of what he might have done in private that we don't know about. I guess one question I would have about this whole stage of the investigation is whether the president could, in fact, be named if there is a conspiracy alleged in the final analysis by Mueller, if he could be named as an unindicted co-conspirator, as Richard Nixon was many years ago. Is that a possibility either to Joyce or Maya.
Maya, what do you think?
I think to Joyce's point, which is an important one, this really does depend on how the Department of Justice looks at this institutionally. We already have a Congress that's going after Rod Rosenstein for impeachment, literally for acquitting his responsibility to the United States of America. It's very hard to know, but I actually think, and I'm one of the folks that thinks that it also depends what the court of public opinion says. If there is sufficient evidence that becomes public that Donald Trump committed crimes beyond obstruction of justice, which I think is already in the public record, that there could be a reckoning that creates even potentially a constitutional crisis. But certainly unindicted co-conspirator, I would think, would be a possibility if there is sufficient direct evidence.
Joyce Vance, last word on unindicted co-conspirator.
I think it's likely that we will see the president as an unindicted co-conspirator, and what that means is he won't be named, he won't be indicted, and Justice Department policy is not to include the name of a target that you don't indict in a case. So that's why his name won't be used, but much as we saw in Mueller's most recent indictment, where people quickly realized that Roger Stone was the person referenced in a series of conversations, we might see the president in a cameo appearance like that in a subsequent Mueller indictment.
Joyce Vance, Maya Wiley, Eugene Robinson, thank you for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.